They were Rome's purest daughters, untouched, unbroken, and chosen by the gods, or so the city claimed. In truth, these sacred virgins were prisoners in ivory robes, buried in silence before they ever broke their vows. When a Vestal failed to keep the flame alive, or worse, let a man close Rome, didn't just punish her, it erased her. Buried alive in a lightless tomb beneath the earth, her crime was chastity lost, her sentence was silence. This is the story Rome never wanted told. What they did to their sacred virgins. They said she was blessed the moment she was chosen, but she only remembered the silence. She was 12 years old when her mother stopped speaking to her, when her hair was shaved, and the white veil was lowered over her head. From that day forward, she belonged to the flame, one of 6 Vestal Virgins, handpicked by the Pontifex Maximus himself. She would never know marriage, never know touch, and never know freedom again. Her name would be struck from her family's record, and her future given to the gods. Inside the Atrium Vestae, time moved differently. The floors were cold even in summer. The walls whispered, always, with the weight of unspoken things. The other girls rarely smiled. They walked like statues draped in fabric, their eyes hollowed by rules they dared not break. She learned quickly, never let the flame die, never bleed where it can be seen, never speak unless spoken to, and never, ever be alone with a man. Outside, the people praised them, tossed garlands at their feet, called them sacred. But sacred was only another word for caged. The guards watched too closely. The priests watched even closer. At night, when the city quieted, she could hear it, the low hum of dread buried in the stone. One of the older Vestals whispered once that the walls remembered names Rome had tried to forget. Girls who laughed too loud, girls who loved once, girls who bled and were blamed. No one spoke of what happened after a Vestal was accused, but they all knew. The girl who slept in her cot last year had disappeared in the night. No ceremony, no goodbye. Only the faint smell of wet earth near the back corridor. They said the flame chose her, but the flame, she had learned, was only fire. It flickered, it faltered, and it was hungry. She was never touched again, not by her mother, not by her sisters, not even by the wind outside the temple walls. Once the veil had been placed upon her head, the world around her recoiled. Her skin belonged to the gods now, and any hand that dared graze it, even in comfort, risked polluting her. She remembered the last time someone held her. It was her father, moments before the ceremony, kneeling low and placing a kiss on her forehead, as if it were a farewell. It was. The house of the Vestals was both sanctuary and prison, wrapped in rituals no one dared question. The laws governing their bodies were etched deeper than stone. No affection, no embrace, no closeness. The penalty for breaking this sacred rule was not whispered, only felt like breath on the back of one's neck. In the early years, she watched the others struggle. One girl sobbed quietly after dropping a bowl in the kitchen, but when the priest approached, she bowed so low her forehead struck the marble. She was never seen again. Another was caught sneaking a glance at a young soldier during festival week. Her name vanished from the ledger, her face from memory. There were no warnings, no second chances. The purity of a Vestal wasn't just symbolic, it was political. Her untouched body ensured Rome's prosperity, her virginity a safeguard against collapse. Any slip, any perceived stain, was seen as a crack in the foundation of empire. And yet they were still women. They bled quietly into cloth, tucked beneath layers of wool. They burned with questions they were never allowed to ask. She once saw a wounded bird fall into the temple garden, its wing broken and flapping in panic. She knelt to help it, but one of the guards barked at her from behind the gate. Do not touch, do not interfere. Even the broken must be left alone. Over time, she learned to walk without sound, to smile without warmth, to exist without being seen. Her arms hung loosely by her side, never crossing over her chest, never offering comfort to another. To be a Vestal was to float through life like smoke without contact, without weight. But sometimes, deep in the hours before dawn, she would press her hand against the cool temple stone, imagining it pressing back. It never did. The gods don't touch. They only take. She had learned to keep her eyes low, her mouth shut, and her thoughts silent, but in Rome, Silence was never empty. It pulsed behind walls, drifted through corridors, and filled the spaces between the women who had given their lives to the flame. The veil she wore was thin, almost weightless, yet it separated her from the world like a curtain drawn in a theater where no one clapped. But behind it, she began to hear things, not voices, not at first just a breath here, a glance too long, a sudden stillness when someone entered the room. The Vestals were supposed to be sisters, equal and sacred, but there was a hierarchy that lived in the corners of their eyes. The eldest whispered to the Pontifex Maximus in tones meant to carry. The youngest scrubbed blood from altar stones when no one was watching. And sometimes, in the hour just before dawn, the women gathered not to pray but to speak in hushed threads of warning. She listened. That was how she learned about the one who bled too early and was sent away, the one who had a brother that lingered too long at the temple gates, the one who was seen crying after dusk and never woke in her bed again. They didn't call it punishment. They called it purification, correction, a return to sacredness. But no one ever returned. One of the older Vestals, her lips cracked with age, told her never to let a man speak her name aloud. It gave him power. Another warned her to sleep facing the wall because the marble had ears, and not all eyes in the temple were human. There were priests who moved too quietly, and guards who stayed too long at the edge of the baths. There were scrolls hidden under floorboards and prayers scratched into the backs of wooden spoons. Not all the whispers were about men. Some spoke of the flame itself, how it flickered strangely when a girl was lying, how it once extinguished at the very moment a priest's robe brushed against a Vestal's arm. They said the gods knew that the fire did not forgive. She began to understand that the veil was not protection. It was concealment. It kept the truth soft, blurred, holy. It kept the city from seeing that its sacred daughters were not worshipped. They were watched, trapped. And when one of them slipped, even slightly, Rome did not search for the truth. It looked for a spectacle, and the crowd always came. There was no warning. One moment, she was lighting the sacred flame. The next, her hands were seized by two guards whose faces she did not know. She was not told what she had done, only that she must come. The temple floor had never felt so distant beneath her sandals. They took her through the forum, where people stared but did not speak. The silence was heavier than any accusation. When a Vestal was brought to trial, no scroll was read aloud, no charges were written down. The Pontifex Maximus stood high above her, draped in layers of red and white, and he did not call her by name. He asked only one question, but not to her. He turned to the others, senators, priests, the ones whose glances she had long since learned to fear, and asked if the flame had been dishonored. She was not allowed to answer. Her mouth stayed closed, though it burned to scream. The flame had never gone out. Her steps had never faltered. She had done nothing but obey, but none of that mattered. It never did. A Vestal's purity was not measured in truth but in perception. A glance, a rumor, a political need, any of it could spark suspicion. And suspicion, when whispered by the right man, became fact. They spoke around her as though she were already gone. Her silence was not a defense but a sentence. She was a ghost sitting before them, waiting to be buried. The trial lasted no more than an hour. There were no witnesses, only nods. No verdict, only a quiet turning away. When the Pontifex Maximus finally looked at her, he did not raise his voice. He only said the words that sealed her fate. Let her be returned to the earth from which she came. She wanted to cry out, to beg, to demand someone speak truth, but the rules forbade it. A Vestal on trial must remain dignified, even when condemned. Her legs trembled as she stood, the veil falling slightly from her head. No one moved to fix it. The crowd had gathered outside, though none would admit why they had come. Rome pretended it grieved, but it always showed up when there was blood in the air, even when the blood was buried. She was led away, not as a criminal, not as a girl, but as a symbol that had cracked, and when the door of the temple closed behind her, no prayer followed. Only the sound of sandals echoing on stone, heading toward the place where all accused Vestals eventually disappeared. They did not call it execution, they called it tradition, mercy even, because a Vestal's blood could not be spilled, not by sword, not by lash, not by accident. Her body was sacred, even in disgrace. So Rome found a quieter way to kill. Beneath the city, just beyond the Colline Gate, there was a small underground chamber carved into the earth, lined with smooth stone and silence. It was called the Campus Sceleratus, the Field of the Wicked. No monument marked it, no prayers were spoken there, only footsteps, always accompanied by chains. That morning, she was dressed in white, her veil replaced. The priests insisted she appear holy in death, even if they believed her unclean in life. A litter carried her through the streets. She was not bound. She did not scream. That was part of the ritual. She was expected to walk to her grave with dignity, the way a true Vestal would. The people lined the road, faces pale with curiosity and fear. No one looked her in the eyes. No one dared. They feared the gods too much. At the edge of the field, a staircase led downward into the soil. She descended without help. Below, the chamber waited, a small room prepared just for her, no larger than a prison cell, a couch of straw, a single oil lamp, a loaf of bread, a small jug of water. Enough, they said, to claim she had not been buried alive, that she had been given a chance. But everyone knew the truth. She would not be fed again. The door above her closed with the softest sound she had ever heard, like a breath, like a hand brushing over a grave. Darkness followed instantly, swallowing the edges of her body until even her own skin felt distant. She sat on the couch, hands folded, waiting for fear to take her. But it did not come. What arrived instead was memory. Her mother's hands in her hair, the warmth of sunlight on temple stone, the bird she had once tried to save, wings trembling. She wept for it now, not because she was dying, but because she had never been allowed to live. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time had no shape underground. The lamp flickered until it didn't. The air grew still. And when the last breath left her body, there were no gods watching, only dirt, only stone. And above, far above, the city moved on. The people prayed, the flame still burned, and another young girl, barely 12, was chosen to wear the veil. They say the temple is empty now, but the air still holds its breath. The house of the Vestals, once the heart of sacred Rome, is nothing more than stone and ruined columns cracked by time, chambers open to the sky, gardens overtaken by weeds. But those who walk its paths alone speak of something deeper than history, something that lingers. Guides avoid the innermost corridor. They call it superstition, say the cold is just the marble, but those who step there at dusk describe a silence too heavy to be natural. They say the torches flicker even without wind. They say they hear footsteps when they are still. They say the walls echo the sound of someone breathing who is no longer alive. Once, 6 Vestals walked this ground, their veils brushing the floor, their sandals light as ghosts. Now the only ones who return are the ones who remember or the ones who feel remembered. Beneath the stones lies the shape of chambers long sealed, passageways that led nowhere on any map. A small door behind the altar, bricked over in the late days of the Empire, still bears marks from nails or fingertips, scratches that seem too desperate to be ritual. And in the private garden where once only the sacred were allowed to walk, olive trees bend as if hiding something. No birds sing there. No insects stir the leaves. A tourist once collapsed in that garden. Her hands were covered in dust, though she hadn't fallen. She said she heard weeping, not loud, just near, like someone praying and trying not to be heard. They dismissed it. Heat stroke, they said. The temple remembers differently. Its stones hold the weight of voices never permitted to speak, of footsteps silenced too soon. The punishment may have ended, but the presence has not. Those girls were not forgotten, not by the earth, not by the air. The marble holds their last moments like breath trapped beneath glass, unmoving, unbroken, waiting, and still, the city forgets. Tourists pass through with cameras and smiles, never knowing what lies just beneath. But if you step too slowly, if you breathe too deeply in that ruined place, you may feel it, the echo of a vow once made by trembling lips, and the terrible silence that followed. It was said that Rome burned its sins to preserve its glory. Temples collapsed, scrolls vanished, names were rewritten until they suited the story the empire wanted to tell. but some truths refuse to die in fire. In forgotten libraries, tucked behind crumbling walls and beneath layers of imperial dust, records still exist, fragments of lives that Rome meant to erase. A half-charred ledger lists 6 names, but the 7th has been scratched out so violently the parchment tore. One sealed tablet, found buried beneath a senator's estate, speaks of a Vestal who never made it to trial, her body discovered before the priests could silence her. The ink is faded, but not gone. It tells of bruises, of a broken wrist, of a torch found beside her chamber door. That scroll was never meant to survive. And yet it did. It always begins with a name: Claudia, Emilia, Licenia, girls taken from noble families, paraded as symbols of divine favor, then condemned in whispers. Their offenses were never proven, only presumed. The people believed the priests because they were taught not to question the gods. But behind every accusation was a reason too political to say aloud. A senator whose influence needed reinforcement, a general who needed a scapegoat for his failed campaign, a rival priest who sought a higher seat. The Vestals were convenient sacrifices, holy enough to be mourned, disposable enough to be buried alive, and yet some resisted. There are letters, unsigned but penned in a woman's hand, begging for intervention. One cries out that the flame had not died but was smothered. Another claims that the pontifex had come to her room alone. These letters were found sealed in a wall, never delivered, but someone wrote them, someone tried to speak. And even now, deep in museum vaults and private collections, pieces surface, rings too small for a wife, carved with names no record can place. A broken comb with a prayer scratched beneath its teeth, a bone hairpin found inside a sealed wine jar in the ruins of the Atrium Vestae. These are not relics, they are remnants. Warnings, proof. Rome could burn temples, but it could not unwrite pain. It could silence the girls, but not the walls they touched. The truth buried with them does not sleep. It waits in ash, in ink, in stone. And though the empire fell, the secret remains. They were not protected. They were punished, and the gods Rome worshipped never spoke a word in their defense. They were meant to disappear, no grave, no mourning, no song. The Vestals who failed, if failure was even the right word, were not remembered by name, only by absence. That was the point. Rome needed the illusion of divine purity more than it needed the truth of its daughters. The city swore it protected its sacred virgins, but in reality, it feared them. A woman with power and no husband, a girl whose body represented the fate of the entire empire. That was never protection, that was pressure laced with ritual, and when it cracked, they buried the proof. But silence does not stay silent forever. In every ruin where a whisper lingers, in every corridor where the air turns colder, the memory of what was done persists not as a tale of holiness, but as a quiet, rotting wound beneath the stone. What was meant to stay silent still speaks in the corners of Rome. It speaks through the uneven scrape marks beneath the old bricked door of the temple, through the priest's tomb missing its nameplate, through the records marked void without explanation. No one records the last words of a buried Vestal. No one even confirms if she ever had them. They lowered her into the chamber, they sealed the earth, and then they erased her like she had never drawn breath. But a city that kills its own daughters cannot hide forever. Time does not obey empire. Truth does not obey priests. And the voices buried alive tend to find their way back through legend, through fear, through the bone-deep knowing that something once sacred was desecrated by those who claimed to protect it. What was meant to stay silent is the reason the temple still feels watched. Why the garden will not grow, why the walls whisper not prayers, but questions. The flame may have gone out, but the fire beneath the stone never did. We do not know how many were taken. We do not know how many died breathing through darkness. But we know this: Rome was built on silence, and silence remembers everything. If you want more forgotten truths, buried voices, and untold histories, like and subscribe to Forgotten Stories Ancient World. The past may be silent, but we're listening.